Number 3, I'm actually really excited about. Number 3 is Dennis Cruz, who I used to work with at Gersh. Dennis, I love you. Oh my God. I popped real hard when I saw his name. Here, Dennis, I'm gonna shoot straight with you because I love you. I'm gonna pick this apart. This is gonna be a long one. I'm gonna pick this apart in segments, and we're gonna just walk through it together. Okay. So segment number 1, has there been any concrete correlation between first-person shooter addiction and single shooter mass murder in America? I rarely see it mentioned, but have a powerful suspicion that it's there. Okay, so let's start here. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I don't think that content makes a person. Also, no, there hasn't been any studies done. Every time there is like a mass shooting, if they happen to have a console in their house, they will always mention it on the news. But there hasn't been any sort of like tracking in any sort of like actual scientific way. So no. But what I will say, I struggle with this because I watched the movie Freaks growing up, and I don't want to be a sideshow freak. You know, I watched wrestling my whole life, and I don't want to be a wrestler. So I reject the fact that watching or playing or doing something, even if it does put you into the mind of that person, because I would argue that people are different. And for me, watching Titanic when I was a kid, I stayed home from school for 2 days because I was clinically depressed. So like, you don't necessarily need to be in the first person POV to experience something deeply. So like, I don't necessarily believe or co-sign the idea that first-person shooter and also the word addiction is dangerous, because like, what qualifies an addiction? It's mainly chemical. So like, I'm not sure about the word addiction here, but first-person shooter affiliation or passion, whatever, hobbyism, I don't necessarily think that makes a person a murderer. Clearly, I mean, that would be strong power of suggestion there. What I do think is that if you have that piece inside of you, something like a first-person shooter game could hone that part of your brain. What you're doing is creating pathways inside of your brain that allows for information to be filled through those pathways. And so if you already have that pathway built, and then you're feeding it with this information of like first-person shooter, and you're basically playing out your fantasy until you're able to go do it. But a lot can be said about the same with pedophilia, I would say, actually, not to relate video games to pedophilia, just stay with me for a second. But what I'm saying is that a lot of people will say, if you watch any documentaries on pedophilia from the perspective of the pedophile, not usually, in certain cases they'll say that they watch porn that is heavily suggested to be pedophilic, not saying that it is, saying that, oh, barely 18 or whatever, to help quell that part of themselves that wants to act on that desire that they have. But what you'll find is escalation. And so if you feed into that part of yourself, generally you will find yourself becoming more and more prone or inclined to act on your feelings. And that's just classic escalation of like any kind. You see it with literally anything. You see it with drug abuse. You see it with serial killers. In the way that like they start with hurting animals and then escalate. And so I do think that there's something to be said about the idea of escalation as it relates to first-person shooters and single-person mass shootings in America, for sure. But I'm not going to say it's because of that. But the person who's going to do that is going to find a way to justify, whoa, hello, Stuttertown, to justify and validate their own feelings and their own desires. And I don't think that it means that we need to eradicate first-person shooters. I think that it means that we need to do better to help people in the way of mental health in America, because it's okay to have these feelings. It's not okay. It's normal. It's natural to have feelings that you don't understand. But if you're not able to express them and exercise them, then you're going to find different avenues, which, as we've seen, not great. So I would say instead of getting rid of first-person shooters, we should make mental health a priority and make therapy accessible to more people. Maybe as accessible as video games. Huh? Whoa, diatribe much, right, Brandon?
That was a good answer, man.
Oh, thanks, dude.
It just reminded me of the time I dropped my cousin off at the Army Reserve.
Mm-hmm.
And at the base, there was this huge video game room with all first-person shooter
That makes sense.
setups. Yeah.
Because they're honing their skill. And,
Yeah.
like, they're also normalizing it. And I do think that there's a level of normalization, but I don't think that it's necessary. I'm not going to say it's not negative, because I think that it's happening across the board with everything, though. I think that we're becoming more transparent as a society, and that means, like, sex, guns, death, mental health, all of it, like, we're becoming exposed to that at a much, much younger age. And I don't know if there's any way to stop it. So that's why my thing is, like, make sure that you're taking care of yourself mentally. Make sure that you are strong guarding yourself mentally, so that when you experience these things, it's not normal to want to shoot people.
Yeah.
So check it out. Oh God. So that was just part one of that question.
Heavy stuff.
Doggy. Okay, cool. And then the second part is equally heavy and a completely different question. Recent fMRI studies have found a correlation between brain damage and sociopathy. How does this affect the narrative regarding human evil? Okay, so first of all, I'm gonna reject the term human evil, because evil is a religious construct. Evil doesn't really mean much unless you believe in an almighty good. So for the purposes of, like, science and this conversation, I'm not going to say evil. But I think what you mean by that is nature versus nurture, the idea that somebody is born with certain inclinations versus somebody is trained, well, not that, reared to have, there it is, certain inclinations. So I mean, I think that it's pretty well documented that brain damage can lead to sociopathy, but I also do believe that, like, there's just because A equals B does not mean that A equals B and C. Okay, too confusing, Rachel. We've seen through countless examples through serial killers and other mass murderers, and also, just like run-of-the-mill crazy people like Ed Gein and stuff. Crazy people is not a polite thing to say, and I'm sorry, but you guys get what I'm trying to say. I feel like I'm allowed to call Ed Gein a little crazy, right? He skinned people. Okay, whatever.
What's his name?
Ed Gein, Gein. He's wonderful. No, he's not wonderful, but okay, let me backtrack. He's not wonderful. He had a very tough upbringing. He was transgender. He didn't have the words for it. So his closest association to women was his mother, because she wouldn't allow him to go see any other women. And so when she died, he skinned her and wore her skin, and then became infatuated with the idea of this, like, new beautiful woman he was, and then skinned a bunch of other women, and then made, like, belts out of nipples, and then lampshades out of chests. I know. Tough shit, right? Yeah, it's hard. It's hard out there when you don't have anybody to talk to. Anyway, I think that the association between brain damage and sociopathy is pretty well documented. So I would say that, like, I can't answer nature versus nurture, because I think it's both. I do think nature has a lot to do with where you end up, but I think that nurture is the thing that encourages your nature. So if you're born a certain way, if you're born with certain chemical imbalances or lack thereof, like, I feel like sociopathy is like certain parts of your brain are just kind of like sleeping. They're a little sleepy. There are plenty of functional sociopaths who live in society, function in society, have families, and deal with that on, like, a very regular basis, because they were nurtured in such a way that like gave them the tools to live that way. But I think that nature is a little bit less spooky to me than brain damage. So if you're born a sociopath, that's not a thing that people say anymore. I think it's antisocial personality disorder is what they call it. Because sociopathy it's kind of like taken on a term of its own and doesn't really mean anything anymore because everyone's calling everyone a sociopath these days. Once American Psycho came out, basically the medical board was like, well, we can't use the term sociopath anymore because now it's that. So they call it antisocial personality disorder. And to me, that's like a chemical imbalance that's manageable. That's something that you need to recognize at a young age, definitely have consistent therapy for, and make sure that you're managing from like a responsible adult perspective. But it doesn't give you violent tendencies. It just makes you less inclined to understand how right or wrong your actions are. You know the difference, you just don't really care, I guess, is that? Because the psychopath, whatever, it's not, we're not talking about that right now. But what's a little bit spookier to me is brain damage, because that means that by force something was turned off inside of your brain. So a part of your brain that was active at one point is now inactive because of blunt force trauma. And that's scary to me, because it's like there's something natural about a brain disorder. You know, there's something natural about having a chemical imbalance, because not everyone, many people do. But when something is shaken out of place, there's kind of no rule book for that. There's no where do you go from there? First of all, you have to figure out where that abnormality is, and then you have to figure out how that affects every single part of your brain, because you weren't born that way. You were made that way. And that's not nurture, that's forced nature is what it is. Ooh, it's nature, nurture, forced nature. Spooky dookie. Wow.